Hi, everybody. Welcome to Australia at Home and to our second Guardian Australia Book Club. Anyone who came to our first, welcome back. Everyone else, you are in for a treat today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Steph Harmon. I'm the culture editor of Guardian Australia. Before I throw to our incredible guest today, I want to acknowledge that we're hosting this from Indigenous land. I'm on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I know you'll join me in paying respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and in recognising that this land was never ceded. For those who haven't been involved at one of Australia at Home's Zoom talks before, there's a few tips. So firstly, turn your cameras on, turn your screen to gallery mode on the top right corner, and you can get a sense of the hundreds of people who have joined us today. Hello. Second, if you open the chat on the bottom of the screen, you can type in to introduce yourself, chat with each other, ask some questions of our great guests today, make comments. We're going to be calling up some of you during the discussion, so we're going to be monitoring that in real time. And if we want you to ask a question to our guests, we'll be unmuting your mics. So keep an eye on your DMs, because one of our moderators will throw to you and say, ready to be on camera. Finally, we are filming all of this, so please be aware of that. Keep it relaxed, inclusive, keep it nice. Just a bit about the theme today. So we've framed this around a Guardian Australia column we launched in lockdown, which is loose title, What's the Australian Book You Finally Have Time to Read? Tara June Winch is zooming in all the way from France, where it is extremely early in the morning. Thank you, Tara. She wrote one of last year's most astounding novels in The Yield, and she chose Alexis Wright's Carpentaria as the book to take into lockdown. The Yield was picked as one of Guardian Australia's unmissable books of 2019, as was the brilliant Damascus by Christos Tsiolkas, who also joins us now. He picked Randolph Stow's The Merry-Go-Round in the Sea to literally take into quarantine with him. Michael Williams, he's leading the discussion with them both, so I'm going to throw to them all now. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Steph. Thank you for having us, and a big hello to everyone joining us for this, our second book club. And as Steph says, we're doing things a little bit differently this month. Last month, our guest was the wonderful Julia Baird, and we talked about her book, Phosphorescence. But there's something incredibly inhibiting about talking about a book while the author's in the room. So we thought this month we would throw things a little wider. We have two extraordinary authors, as Steph said, as our guests, but we're approaching them more as readers than as writers themselves. And as the Guardian series suggests, we're reflecting on the ways in which maybe there are Australian books that we haven't quite got around to and that we might be reading now, finally, when we have a little bit more time on our hands. I'm going to, at any point, if you want to join the conversation, please feel free. We'd love to hear from you. That can be with your comments about the books that we're discussing or your own tips for Australian classics that you adore. But to kick things off, I thought I might come to you, Christos, and ask what your first memory of being taught Australian literature was. What was your first awareness that an author you were reading was an Australian?
Wow, that is a good question because, firstly, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for this. And it's wonderful to be here with you, Michael, and with you, Tara. Look, I'm going through that little box of memories in my head, and I can't remember a teacher ever saying this is an Australian book. What I remember was finding, and maybe one of you will help me with this. What I remember was finding a book in the library, in a suburban library, and it had a little boy walking through the streets of Melbourne, a child really, who hears some music. And he becomes fascinated by the music. I've never, ever been able to trace who that little boy was and what that book was. So if anyone who is listening to this knows, please tell me now, because it was my first awareness of that a book could be set in your town. You know, I must have been, if I think back to it, I must have been the first year of high school, so maybe 11, 12. So it came quite late. The other memory that's really, really strong is, and it's about your world being made familiar, is being a teenager, and this is middle high school, and coming across Monkey Grip in a suburban bookshop, and sitting on the floor of the bookshop, and a wonderful woman used to run it. and just starting to read it. I think I read half the book in that city.
Booksellers must love you.
I love them.
You've got to pay for it, Christos. I'm just interested in that feeling of recognition and that familiarity and how that fired different synapses for you as a reader, how important it was.
Look, I think it's important to say that maybe one of the things that complicated that notion of reading Australia, and, I've talked about this before, and I know I've talked about it, I think, with both of you. For me, so there's that early period of falling in love with reading. And then as you search more for something in the reading experience, I fell in love with the great Jewish American books of the mid 20th century. That's why people like Mailer, Roth, Dermot Schwartz are so important to me. And I think it was because in that writing I heard also the voice of the migrant child or the migrant grandchild that I hadn't heard in the Australian literature that I was being introduced to, or that I was on the syllabus at school. So there was kind of this complicated sense of what it meant to read Australia, because it in a way, Garner's book is so phenomenal for me, because up to 12 years, 13 years of age I grew up in inner city Melbourne. So I'd actually walk the streets that Nora in that book walks along. But actually she sees a completely different Melbourne to me. But it maybe something that has remained from that experience is how important place is for a novelist and for a reader.
I think you raised some really important, really fascinating points there. And I think flag the limitations of purely using a national lens to understand literary traditions that I think we'll dig into a bit more deeply. But I might throw to you all the way in the other hemisphere there, Tara, and ask you the same question. Do you have memories of early discoveries of Australian writers for you? Oh, you're muted. I should warn you.
Yeah, press unmute. I came to writing so late. Came to books so late. It wasn't until, my teens, we really didn't grow up in a house with books. There was one of those big black and gold encyclopedia sets from a traveling salesman, but that was it. And so it was kind of just whatever, it was incidental, whatever I read. I remember the teacher giving us Robert Frost. So everything was old England, or just then in later teens going through that, George Orwell phase and just getting given, those kind of backpacker novels. And then it wasn't really until I had a publishing contract with UQP, and because I was living in my van, they actually gave me an office. Gave me a space in the office at the publishers to write Swallow the Air. And so all I read was what was there at UQP. That was like my first introduction to Australian writing. So it was, and because they've got the Black Australia writing series and have done since, the early 90s. So it was everything, like collections of Aboriginal writing. Alexis Wright was first published there. Larissa Brent, Anita Heiss, some of her stuff was there. Well, it was kicking around anyway, but all Melissa Lukashenko's early works. That was my first introduction to Australian literature. So yeah, all very late.
But it sounds like a wonderful introduction in that it was one that had direct relevance to both your own writing and the experience of discovery. I think it's a great cliche that does a great disservice to many wonderful teachers out there. But, people often talk about having their passion for books stifled by being taught them badly. I wonder whether there's a tradition of teaching Australian literature that for many generations, less so more recently, was about revering a particularly conservative idea of Australianness. you think there's anything to that, Christos?
Look, I think that there is. I'm really conscious that I have to speak of a particular time and place that I got taught, and it was the 70s, early 80s, and I remember this, Michael. I remember this, Tara, that we did third year at high school was bloody Australian history. It was history, and it was all just Australia, and the last period, which was a double period, we did Aborigines and migrants. That was the only history we got about the Indigenous culture, right? So what we were being taught was a very, very, I liked what you said, Tara, about Old English. It was a really Old English version of what Australia is. I can't remember through the whole of my experience at high school being given an Australian book that made me excited. I can't even remember the Australian books. That was how unexciting it was. So I do think there's a problem with how books are taught. And when I talk to my nieces and nephews and friends' kids, I still think there's some of those problems now. It's not only about the content, what the books are, but how do you make it relevant to young people's lives? And I think that's a really hard thing for any teacher to do. I was just, like Tara, I didn't grow up in a world of books. It just wasn't where my parents came from. But they were so excited about the fact that I could read, and they gave me books. I've told, it's a very important story I tell about my father, that every payday, which I think was Thursday back then, he would go straight from the paymaster, because you got your pay in a little yellow envelope, and go down to the local bookshop in Richmond and buy me 2 books, and just because he was so proud that his son could read. And so that formed me, and it was the greatest gift, really, because he couldn't read English. I had a totally uncensored collection of books there, and it did make me think that it's not nation that's important when it comes to books, it's story. I was reading from, the world was opening up to me. And the other person I have to thank is a man called Jaroslav Havia, who was my English teacher in high school, a Czech immigrant who loved literature. His great love was actually French literature. And he made the novel come alive. He must have seen. He was very intuitive, and I think he realised. He realised that I had a great love of literature and cinema and music, and he wanted to encourage that. I think he probably suspected or knew that my sexuality was going to make, for a period, was going to be a difficult thing. And he gave me the great French novels. He gave me the great European novels to read. And I think it was a way of him saying, don't worry about the syllabus in English. This is what I think will make you excited about reading. And you really need those people in your life. I don't know if you agree, Tara, in terms of making people like us writers, having that kind of person
that
in your
early
life.
support.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't.
You recognise that you needed those stories, or did you recognise the potential as a writer in you as well?
Maybe he did. I don't know maybe he did. That's true. I have never, thought about that before, but maybe he did.
Yeah. There was a high school. Oh, sorry, Michael.
Oh, go, Tara.
Oh, there was a teacher, Mr. Alexander, that I had when I was about 15. And that was sort of, because before that, the teachers were like, you'll do nothing good. You're bad. But this is kind of true. There was this one teacher who sort of favoured me and liked my writing. And sort of basically encouraged me to drop out of school, so much so, because it wasn't, I think sometimes those mentors that show story to introduce you to a different way of thinking aren't often the ones that are academically trying to help you, but trying to help, can see like that you're in pain, that you need a different type of story. And that's what was true for me with that particular teacher. Yeah, English teacher.
The ways in which teachers shape our reading and shape our understanding of a literature are wonderful. We're getting some incredible comments in on the chats. A cavalcade of enthusiasm for Norman Lindsay appearing there at the moment. But I was wondering if we could hear from Debbie Kearns or Kearns. Debbie, are you there to talk about your particular teacher?
Yes, hello, I'm happy to. I went to school in Sydney, Lower North Shore, and in the 70s, I had an English and a French teacher called Mrs. Levesque. And as a French teacher, Mrs. Levesque was famous for using a hand puppet to try and teach us how to say our names. You know, je m'appelle Jules, he would say to you until you worked out that you were meant to go back, je m'appelle Debbie. So years later, and I think I actually read the book, and it's called Being Cynthia, I think, is her most well-known book. And it's a wonderful little book. And the author was Amy Whiting. And I did some research, and Amy Whiting turned out to be the writing name of my English teacher from high school. And her history background was actually fascinating, and mostly French teacher. And she'd married, I think, a French man, the name Mrs. Levesque, and possibly, but had never been to Paris. I think one of the things I remember, and I remember being told by fellow students later, that her accent was absolutely a tragic, you know, classic Australian French accent that we were being taught in the 70s. But I had it just never even came up. Then at that time, she was writing short stories still. And I haven't researched it again recently, but I seem to recall that she actually won or got quite a prestigious kind of comment on her work back in the 50s, maybe even the 40s. But life just didn't open up for her to really progress as a, you know, do a lot of writing. And so she did some writing later. And I think it just, and I've been sitting here, I can't think of a single Australian book that we read in my high school years, not a single one.
Debbie, I like to think that by osmosis, having been taught by Amy Whiting, got your love of Australian literature there. Christos, do you stealthily teach any English or French classes under the blue?
No, I do not. Look, in the late 90s, I actually began a debate because I was thinking of teaching, because having had this, you know, having had a teacher like Mr. Javier, and because it was clear in my life that having a great teacher, or having a good, I mean, he was a great teacher. I was hoping to be a good teacher, makes a difference. But I realised really early on I had to, I mean, it was a selfish choice, but I made it. If I wanted to commit to being a teacher, and I wanted to work in the state system, and I wanted to work in schools that you know, that the kids really needed good teachers, you have to make that what I've made writing, which is a vocation. Those kids don't need a part-time teacher. They don't need, you know, they need someone who's going to be there for them. But I do love kind of that educational, pedagogical relationship, and I would like to find ways of doing it more. I mean, I've enjoyed going into, for example, creative writing courses, and but there's something about that that's a little bit different to what spurred me on to think about teaching in the first place. You know?
I mean, the reason I wanted to start the conversation today about the relationship between teaching and writing and national literature is that I think if there is or has historically been a tendency to do what Tara was pointing to of viewing Australian literature as being very much from an English tradition, there's an extent to which recognising the new traditions that are emerging out of Australian literature is about recognising new possibilities for writers, for the kind of society and culture we want to be. I'm curious, I might get you, Tara, to talk a little bit about Alexis Wright and Carpentaria, which many of you in the book club may have read Tara's fantastic piece for the Guardian's series on why this is a kind of work of Australian literature you revere. Can you tell us a little bit about what that book means to you, Tara?
I think foremost, for me, it's such a brave novel. It's so experimental with language. The way that Alexis tackled the idea of all time within a novel, and the playfulness with the English language is just so it's just it's powerful, and the fact that it's so big is another one. I thought it was really important for Australian readers to completely immerse themselves in the story, and they really do get immersed with these characters that are constantly talking, that are showing this this river underneath the ground, there's just so much, it's so dense. And I thought there's so many great Indigenous novelists in Australia. There was too many to recommend. And of course, it was always going to be blackfellow literature that I was going to recommend. But this was sort of, it's a difficult book to read. It's not until you get into that second half that you can sort of, feel comfortable that you're going to get to an end point. I think it was, it was like pushing on that difficulty. It was like, do the hard yards, read this like difficult, beautiful, challenging one you're going to put down. And that's why I kept insisting you have to read all the way through. For me, the story is a story that it comes up again and again, and always has in Aboriginal writing, and it mixes, issues of mining and disenfranchisement from land, the impact of colonisation, jutting up against the dreaming and all time, and the beauty of culture and the balm of culture. I mean, that's sort of a signifier of all our literature, I think. But for me, when I really love a book, I'm always attracted to the language and the playfulness with how people use words, rather than an overall plot or a point to get to. And for me, Carpentaria is a piece of art. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes perfect sense. It's such a, actually reading your piece about it made me want to go back and reread it, because it's a wonderful book. There was a review, I can't remember where it was, of one of Marilyn Robinson's novels once, that said that it was a novel that taught you how to read it as you read it. And I think that a bit about Carpentaria, that it's so different, I think, to so much else that I was reading around the time that I read it, that I had to find the rhythms, and it's an incredibly generous book. It invites you into the language in really amazing ways.
Yeah. You know what it actually reminds me of? It reminds me of, in that way, and you're right, it tells you how to read it. It tells you to calm down. It reminds me a bit of the Japanese Nobel laureate Kazuo Ishiguro's The Unconsoled.
Yeah. In
the way that he's telling you to be completely stressed, It was a book about stress. So yeah, it's like she wants you to be in a state. I don't know. See, it's funny to talk about other people's writing when they're not here to talk about themselves. I don't want to get it wrong,
Do you, you've had the experience now as a writer of other people bringing their own reading of your work to you. Can they get it wrong, or do they just have a different take that is kind of its own thing?
I think I can get it wrong. I got a letter the other day that that you know the yield was too much like Too Much Lip, except Too Much Lip was a real depiction of Aboriginal women, and the yield must have been a lie because these Aboriginal women were quiet and nice. So
Okay.
of course they get it wrong because this is, what's that, sorry?
People can get it wrong. That's well demonstrated.
Yeah. It's funny because I saw in the comments about Too Much Lip, I just saw it pop up, is because in 2016, 5,000 words of the yield were published in the Westerly, and I got an email a couple of days later in caps, and it said, "We're writing the same novel." That was the subject line. And it was Melissa Lukashenko writing Too Much Lip back in 2016. And she said, I think I'm still kicking around with this idea. Your book will come out before mine. Of course it didn't, but yeah. But yeah, she was right. After reading 5,000 words, she was right. We were writing the same story. But we're writing the same stories because it's the reality. We're writing a politicized reality. If you don't want us to write the same story, if you don't want us to write about land disposition, we know what to do,
I like the idea that we might finally get some justice in this country because people are harsh literary critics. What a motivating reason. We have a comment from Melanie who had to read Carpentaria a second time. Melanie, are you there?
Yeah.
Hi.
I was just making the comment that I read it not long after it was published and adored it, but I felt more recently, and ironically before Tara's article, I had gone back and reread it, and I just think that the characters are so complex that a second reading is really valuable to start to unpick where they're all coming from and what all the messages are behind this sort of magical place, and yet there's so much relevance to the story of displacement and disconnection and connection that I think it warrants certainly much more detailed reading the second time around.
Thank you, Melanie. I do think there's something in the different way we read stuff a second time around, that rather than getting either stuck in the language or the rhythms of it, or luxuriating in them, once we're schooled in those things, we see very different things the second time around. Barbara made a comment saying, Carpentaria transports readers to another dimension. The poetry of the language is awe-inspiring. Thank you for that comment, Barbara. Christos, I know you're a fan of Alexis's work as well.
Yeah, look, it was actually a novel I was thinking of talking about, and then just realised Tara was going to do a much better job than I can on it. I think that thing you said, Tara, or that both of you were saying, sorry, about it being a book that teaches you how to read is absolutely right. I feel the same way about this one book as well. Like, I think that there's something in she of all our writers is, I just think, a superb. The only analogies I can, the metaphors I think are musical as well. She sings an astonishing song, and you kind of, when I first read Carpentaria, I felt like I was entering a song in terms of the reading. I was thinking too about when you were talking about a book like Carpentaria, that was one of the things, if I could be a teacher, that you do want to teach. And I don't know how do you teach that, but it's by offering that kind of work and offering that kind of patience to someone, and say, if you do this work, it will open up a whole new way of being, of reading. It will open up a whole new way of understanding your world. And, I think that's one of the things I've got to be so thankful for to my parents, to Dad, for you know, by giving me books that were too adult for me, by giving me books that were impossible for a 9, 10, 11-year-old child to understand, he also gave me this gift of saying, he didn't know it, but it was like, if you do this work, something magic will happen in the process.
Tara, you mentioned reading in the UQP offices when you're in the process of writing your first book. How much did reading writers who'd come before you, and particularly Black writers who'd come before you, give you a sense of either pressure or a tradition that you were writing into, or something you wanted to engage with in your own work?
I think what happened was that because it was my first exposure to any sort of writing, and most of it was Black Australia writing, and because I was already, you know, the manuscript had already won the United Award, so it was already well and truly on its way to being a story. But I realized, it was that realization that our mob had written books before. Honestly, that's because I wasn't taught it in school and my parents weren't readers, so how else was I supposed to really know? It's not a conversation that you have going around Australia. It doesn't make sense?
Yeah.
I didn't think I could turn to books to tell me the story of Australia, and that's why, you know, I did drop out of school and did the hitchhiking around Australia for a year to figure out who I was in the country. But then, you know, at 19, coming to finally read the work, I think it was that I found our story in others' stories, you know, our family stories. So it was really gratifying. And then I realized that, I should, you know, finish this book and try hard and, you know, have a sense of like self-respect, and because look at all these, you know, incredible writers that have come before me, and I'm entering into this, you know, this imprint to the Black writing Australia. And so it was kind of a realization of reverence, especially because all the books were, you know, in the early 90s, any like Black Australia writing was coming out through either Fremantle Press, the Indie Press in WA, Mugabala Books, obviously, and, you know, Sue Abbey, who started the Black Australia writing series at UQP. It was all coming through there. A lot is still, it's great. But yeah, it was more a sense of reverence.
We have a comment from Kieran. Kieran, are you there?
Oh, yes. Did I get unmuted? Yeah, I think I'm unmuted.
Hi.
Hello. So is this about my relation to Aboriginal writing now?
Yes.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to just clarify for a second my perspective, because I'm not an Australian and coming at this kind of as a foreigner, and a very proud foreigner in the sense that I'm an Indian American who just happens to live in Melbourne right now. And since I also like to read and write, I'm just trying to understand the literature of the country I'm living in. So when I read Carpentaria, I felt that it was something very similar to the types of things that we see internationally in the 1980s, 1970s, 1990s, in terms of this like late postmodern, like magical realist flourish, but in a very different context than the one that I was used to. So I liked this sort of upheaval, this feeling of kind of presenting a voice that's outside of the narrative of what we normally, like people again like me who are foreigners who don't know much about Australia, are reading, and putting that kind of in the forefront of a literary text. And I definitely think that Alexis is like the Toni Morrison of Australia, but she's not getting read enough, but hopefully that'll change someday. I also really liked Leah Purcell, who I had to read for one of my classes here. I thought that she also just had this really wonderful like postmodern book called, I'm forgetting the name right now. If anyone wants to jump in and tell me very quickly, it's based off of that Henry Lawson short story.
The Drover's Wife.
Thank
you. Yes, thank you so much.
We all said it.
I was thinking over something. Out of me. So also, I liked that way that she respanned the story kind of like around, again, kind of a side character that wasn't even really developed in the original story, but kind of, and it also had its own like kind of politics and kind of its own I guess, problematics as well. This relationship between this this 18th century bushwoman and then this man of whatever origin of the landscape he happens to be from. And I found that, it's a beautiful play as well. I haven't seen it, but I've read the play, and I really liked the way it was structured. And I like the complexities of that relationship. And it also reminded me a little bit of John Reese's Sargasso. Again, names are not hitting me well right now, but yeah, White Sea, so anyways. And finally, Claire Coleman, I thought, wrote a really beautiful exegy on kind of like it's a very interesting post-colonial sci-fi book that really delves into, I think, it's very direct and delves into a very real, I think, problem in how we construct nations and how we imagine nations from a certain category. And so as a result, yes, that's another book I heavily recommend.
There are 3 wonderful recommendations, Kieran, and thank you for that.
Can I, sorry, I just thought that was a really, it just made me think about reading Carpentaria and Kieran's point about it being a postmodern novel. And where I think it's really, that connection to Morrison is really good, because I think Alexis has this. There's no whiff of the academic in it, however. It's like, that's what's so powerful and wonderful about that book too, that it is so intelligent, but it isn't smug or knowing, or, it's a great novel.
Yeah.
And that's, sorry, I was just going to say, what Kieran brought up about the magical realist of the Indian novel. I was wonder if she'd read any Indian novels while writing it, or, the magical realism of the South American novel. I wonder if she read them read any while she was writing this. Yeah, I just want as an aside. But in terms of, and the thing when you said, Christoph, there's not it's not a didactic novel in any sense. It's not, I can't remember the words you used.
Academic, I think, yeah.
Yeah, academic. I know why I don't know that word. Because Alexis in the 70s was writing, she's always been an activist, and in her work as well, she was writing, for land rights and to change laws within communities. She was fighting for her community. So she's written, obviously, Grog War, about the fight for alcohol-free day in Tennant Creek. So she does have a really academic foundation, whereas, you're right, there's no pretense at all. I just wanted to read something before it comes up again about politics and about it coming up again and again in different novels. Yeah. And can you bear with me for a sec while I do?
Absolutely.
It's by a Wiradjuri woman writer who should be here instead of me, Dr. Anita Heiss, and she summed up the literary landscape in an interview. And this is a short paragraph. She said that our writers sit down with a purpose. They use writing as a form of catharsis. They use it as a means to make sure that their voice has a place in Australian literature. They use their writing as a means of having a political voice in a country where we still remain voiceless in a political system, where the arts are the only political platform we have. There is a distinct purpose of getting a story written down, of having a political place in this country, of making sure we have our own self-representation. Because for 2 centuries, people have been representing us in Australian literature. It's about saying, hang on, this is how we are, this is who we are, this is how we view ourselves, and these are our aspirations, regardless of what you think. I just think that sums up like any future conversations.
Thank you for reading that, Tara, because I do think it is a really a powerful and important passage, and also I think an important framing way of thinking about why there is value to understanding what a national literature might look like and how expansive that definition should be, and what it means for a literature to come out of a place. I'm interested because in The Yield, one of the beautiful things in The Yield is Albert Gondawindi is putting together his dictionary because it's important to kind of document, it's important to kind of, and that seems to engage with those ideas Anita's talking about a bit to me. Is that part of what you were doing in that novel?
Yeah, he was taking ownership for his story. He had his own, you know, him and his wife was a family thing, you know, that he had his own self-determination to not just read the words, but be able to write them too. He says that early on. So, yeah, that ability and that that final missive to everything that's happened to him and his people, and his fear of what's to happen next, the future of his people, you know, is comes out in the form of that dictionary. And I don't think, you know, because of the nature of who he is as a character, he didn't scream them on the page, but I hope that you can feel that underlying scream, even though he's talking to you in this really conversational, relaxed, often like chummy kind of way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's enormously successful, and would be keen to make sure everyone participating in this book club who hasn't read The Yield yet, definitely chalk it up as one of the unmissable books we're discussing today. Christos, when you talked about being drawn to the kind of mid-century American writers because you saw a kind of migrant story there that you could relate to, I'm interested to know when you came across Randolph Stow, who's your pick for this series, and what it was that resonated about his work with you as a reader.
Oh, look, I was thinking about, as we were discussing Alexis's work, I think it's a very similar reaction I had to my first encounter with Stow, which was for Tourmaline, a novel, and I wrote about it in the piece for The Guardian. I came across it. I feel like a little bit ashamed that I hadn't read Stow before, you know, but I was very ignorant of, and I much older, but similar to the experience I had with Ghana, I just couldn't stop reading it, and it was because it's also a novel, I think, that you have to work at to hear it, right? And it's also a novel that is so acutely aware of how important the word is. You know, that's what makes fiction. And also to the question of politics we're talking about, it's also a difficult, vexed, not completely successful novel about what it is to be a white body in a black land. You know, what it is to be how do you not write about that and then contribute to a silence, or do you just step back? I mean, I think all of that is going on in that novel, and it seemed to be doing, maybe because it was written at a point where the conversation was different, it just seemed to be unafraid of exploring that contradiction and that difficulty. So I thought this is a remarkable writer, and I want to read more of him. And I think the next book, you know, if memory's not proving me false, the next book was To the Islands, which in a way is a more clear. The clarity in that novel is it's clearer about what it's doing, and it's about the similar terrain to Tourmaline. But in a way, the clarity makes it a lesser favourite of mine. And then I came to Merry-Go-Round in the Sea, which I just think is one of the most beautiful works I've read. You know, that's why when I flew back from Europe and went immediately into 2 weeks quarantine, and thankfully just before where you could still do it at home, and I was pulling books off these shelves behind me. They stretch across the room. Wayne's built this amazing study for us. And Merry-Go-Round in the Sea was one of the novels I pulled out because I just wanted to I guess there is an other element to reading, which is also the pleasure. I just wanted to be in pleasure for a period, and I think I hadn't thought about this until kind of just in this chat, but I also picked James Aggie's A Death in the Family, which I just remember, oh God, just adoring when I first read it, and I hadn't read it for decades, and yeah, so there must be something about that I'm searching in what a writer can do in a young voice.
Yeah,
you know, that's it makes me. I wonder if that's something, some itch there. Anyway, I do think that Stow's novel is remarkable in that it does remind you of what it is to be a child, and it's really bittersweet. You know, it's not at all bloody romantic about that.
it's not at all romantic, but the engine of the book, it seems to me, is so much one about kind of grace and kindness.
Yeah.
And that's I don't know, that feels like a very rare kind of motivating force for a novel.
I actually think that Stow, that's a really good word to use, kindness, because I think kindness is there in every novel of his that I've read. A real kind of generosity about humans, and maybe, I mean, I think, you know, like all us white fellas, he failed at trying to make sense of our place in this collection of nations, in this country, in this world. We're still working that out. It's so, but I think he came with a really generous heart. That's what I get from reading Stow. I also have to say, last year I read a wonderful biography by Suzanne Falconer called Mick, about Stow, and so it's so one, deeply researched, and also but quite a sensitive biography to who this man was, and I guess something I'd heard about but I'd never really known, because I was a later generation, about how impossible it really was to dream a dream of being a writer, and to dream a dream of being a homosexual writer in a place like Australia in the middle 20th century. It's a wonderful biography. So for people who are interested in Australian writing, I really recommend that book. It's from University of Western Australia Press.
That does, I don't want to digress too far, but I can't resist, given that you wrote a book on the subject. When you talked about feeling guilty for not having come to Stow earlier, I know you had a similar reaction to Patrick White. And his name's popped up a lot in the comments ahead of today for people either with an ambivalent relationship with White's work, or him being a touchstone for lots of readers of Australian literature. Can you reflect briefly on White for us?
Oh, look, yeah. I mean, White was, I think, has changed so much over my life. I mean, I tried Voss when I was really young, too young for it, and probably at a time where I was, I was falling in love with other kinds of writing, and I was falling in love with those Americans I mentioned. I was falling in love with the Europeans, like that, and I didn't give that novel the patience that I should have. I realise that now. But, you know, so I talk about it in the book I wrote about White. I do remember she was amazing, this elderly Greek woman, very, very tall, kind of very striking. I always thought, you know, that casting agent in your head, I just went, oh my God, you should have played Helen in the Trojan Women. You know, you could have, you know, I can see why people would go to war for you. She was just this amazingly striking, as I said, imperious and generous woman. And we were in a little tavern in Athens, in Exarchia, and we were talking about literature, and she knew her literature, and she asked me in Greek, you know, and tell me, what do you think of White? What's your favourite novel? And I said, oh, look, I haven't really read lots of, I think, I'd read The Twice Born Affair, and she just went, what? She was so outraged, and she said, "Christo, you have to go and read White." And it's interesting that it took someone from the other side of the world to make me shamed. To go, I think he represented, I'll be really honest, I think he represented to me a whole notion of the dead white male on one level, right? The thing that I've been battling in a different way, clearly to what, you know, to you, Tara, but that kind of battle against that white English voice in our literature. And maybe a sort of confusion, because I also knew he was gay, and maybe that meant that I should like him. I'm not quite sure what was going on in my head with White. And then there was also that part of his biography where his great love was Manolius, a Greek man. So once I came back from that trip in Greece, and I just said, okay, I'm going to take this, because I really respected this and respect this woman. I said, I'm going to read White. And I went, and because I had a secondhand copy again in this study that I'd never opened, and it was A Tree of Man. And my God, again, you have to work to comprehend and enter and listen to that novel. But it is, I think, in the same way that Carpentaria is, miraculous. You know, you can't walk that, you know, you can't walk, it's like, you can't pretend to write those novels. And that's how I feel. But Tree of Man is astonishingly powerful work. And it is also, I read this, and this is why I wanted to write the essay on him. I also realised that what Manolius had done for Patrick White is opening up to the Eastern Orthodox world. It's actually one, even though, you know, White is not necessarily a believer, but it is such it's a book that is alive to the sacred. So that's my rave about Patrick White.
I'm delighted. I deliberately chose that button in the jukebox, Christos, because I knew it was in the comments, we've had so many wonderful comments. I encourage those of you who have the time to have a browse through them, because there are some amazing recommendations. When we publish the video at The Guardian, I'm making a unilateral promise here, we'll try and list as many of the recommendations as we can so that you can do it. But thank you to Robin Jackson and Katja, both of whom commented on Patrick White. Robin made the point that your age and context make rereading a favourite novel very different. She used to love Patrick White, but now finds his work stiff and boring, whereas Katja, in contrast, couldn't enjoy them when she first came to them and now can't put them down. So that thing about the time and place and way we discover a book is so important. Christos, I just wanted to briefly, before we run out of time, touch on Damascus, which I think is a wonderful and extraordinary novel. But I think we have a tendency to not think of books as Australian novels if they're not self-consciously Australian novels. And I wanted to ask you the slightly odd question about the ways in which your Australianness, you think, informs that book.
That's a really good question. It is, you know, isn't it kind of like the most puzzling of questions, really? So, because so few people have said that, and some people have written that it's not an Australian book, and it's like, well, what does that make me? Do you know, like, you know, where, you know, that's an erasure of something that I can't even comprehend. Of course, it's an Australian book because it was written by a man who has Australia on his passport, who was born here. Who this is how I've been formed, and also that I think one of the things that that has formed this country for good and for bad is this encounter with something called Christianity, right? So this is what is the particular part that comes from me, and I think this is connected to what I discovered in reading White and hearing kind of an openness that man must have had to the Orthodox world that Manolius introduced him to. Is what I can bring is to say that perspective is no longer a foreign perspective. It's so, you know, we are still this work as a nation that is still not happening. And I you know, for me, there's this, where is this hope and opportunity? It's in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, right? About one way we can go forward, and recognising what Tara's book, The Yield, does, what Alexis' book, Carpentaria, does, what's, you know, Melissa, Tony. I mean, there's so much bloody amazing writing. Claire's book that is coming out and is speaking to what this country really is, and who this country, what, you know, the history of this country and how profound it is. What I hopefully can, where I can come in there, is to also say the voices of people who have come from across the globe now, and the perspectives and the language, the way what we're doing to the English language can also hopefully come into this place as well, right? So I think it's not about my religion, but because I grew up in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and I grew up in the Greek language, and I grew up in those histories, I think they're no longer not Australian. They're part of what Australia is. Just as the same way that the Quran and what Islam brings is part of the culture, and what Buddhism brings, and what all these ideas and philosophies and thoughts and languages are doing to making a kind of English language that hopefully one day will belong to all of us. Does that make sense, Tara?
Yeah, it is completely straight. And I think what you're trying to say is you writing about early Christianity, the formation of Christianity, is as truth telling as any piece of Indigenous literature that's telling the story of what happened after missionaries came to Australia. That it's foundational, that it's part of our story. Yeah. If you're going to truth tell, then understand all the way back. I agree with you, Christos. I agree with that it's essential to, if people really want to investigate, you know, the history of colonisation in Australia, they should know intentions, because intentions and actions are really important in our history, from settlers to missionaries. Yeah,
I you're absolutely right, and I think that's a very, thank you, because that's a very generous thing to say about truth telling. Yes, I just don't. I wanted to understand part of what makes me Christos Tsiolkas, but also makes this place that I come from. You know, that and I came to, because both those things are happening. I come from and I came to.
I'm going to give both of you one last opportunity to. The suggestions coming in on the comments are wonderful. There is a list of names there that I think more than anything else remind us that the idea of a national literature or a literary tradition isn't a monolith and should never be thought of as a monolith. And the sheer breadth of what is there is what's so exciting and kind of can be endlessly mined. We should be reading all these extraordinary Australian authors. But I wanted to give each of you a chance to name one other author who you would feel guilty if you didn't name, an Australian author who you think is neglected or forgotten, who needs a bit more love.
Oh, should I go first, Christos?
Go, Tara. Go.
Okay, get ready, everyone. To take screenshots. Are you ready? Because I'm going to hold them up.
All right.
You ready? It's going to be fast. Ready? Go. So this one, it's Ruby Langford Guinevere. Read all her work. That's essential. This one, Charmaine Papineau. This one, Marsha Langton, Welcome to Country. Everyone needs to have a copy of this to understand the travel impulse and to understand when they do move around this country. And also, Beirut's book is really essential to understanding like this sense of cruelty that's part of our national psyche. And also Ninu, Grandmother's Lot, which is a bilingual text, and that's the future of Aboriginal writing, is to show more of our, languages. Because there's 250 language groups. A lot of our people speak English as a third, fourth, fifth language. So having more bilingual text is essential to our future of understanding and hearing a voice from all over Australia. That's it.
That's wonderful.
I'm also so impressed by that prop work, Tara. You said this was your first time doing a Zoom, and yet you worked the camera like a pro there. Christos, what's your tip?
I was going to say, I think that's because I'm just old. I'm not that good with screen culture. They were, look, in a way I feel like Tara said it all. That Marshall Langton is what I give when I just like giving it to gifts when I go overseas to Greece, to my family. I will say, in all seriousness, the two books came into my head that I think are undervalued. And to the discussion we're having, there's a woman called Rosa Cappaello, who's an Italian, and she came as a migrant worker to Australia, and she wrote one of the most devastatingly brutal novels about, and again, a novel that is not, you need to work to hear it. I Lucky Country, which I absolutely, I think it's a great work. And Anthony Macris's Capital Volume 1, which I read when it came out, and I was just so astounded by it and envious of it, and I've just reread it recently, and my God, it stands up. So I'm going to say that.
Excellent. I'm sure you would all join me in thanking the remarkable Tara June Winch and Christos Tsiolkas. I'm going to throw back to Steph Harmon from The Guardian, but thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you all. That was just such a wonderful way to spend my Friday lunch break. I can't tell you. Thanks, Tara. Thanks, Christos. Thanks, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for the chat as well. I think we're going to try and turn that into some kind of a epic reading list, because I'm sure a lot of people were taking notes as it kind of scrolled through the screen. We're going to be doing this monthly, so stay tuned to Guardian Australia and Australia at Home to find out what our next session will be. Also, before we go, I've got to thank Australia at Home and their sponsors, Essential Media, Principal Co, Centre for Australian Progress, the Community Council of Australia, and of course, The Guardian Australia. They run these talks at 1 p.m. every day during the week. And coming up next week, they've got talks on the impact of the pandemic on young workers, the experience of new refugees, and the latest Guardian Essential poll. But of particular interest, on Wednesday, there's going to be a discussion with Alexis Wright herself. And this is a bit of a fan club for Alexis. So I think a lot of you are going to come back for that one. She's going to be launching the latest edition of Mianjin. Anyway, thank you so much for your time, everybody, and your thoughts. I really look forward to this next one. Have a lovely weekend.